Chapter 7 of Jenney's begins on page 38, and it is about verbs. It is about the imperfect and future tenses of first conjugation verbs. We have already studied the present tense of first conjugation verbs, and we have studied the present tense of sum esse, the verb to be. So now we are studying two more tenses. There are 6 tenses total in Latin, 3 imperfective or regular tenses, and 3 perfect tenses. We'll be studying the perfect tenses later on. Right now we are adding numbers 2 and 3 to the imperfective tenses. The imperfective tenses are built off the first principal part, but since we haven't studied all 4 principal parts of verbs, that doesn't mean very much to you. The future tense is pretty obvious in terms of its meaning. It's stuff that hasn't happened yet. So in English, if you want to use the present tense for love, you say I love. In English, if you want to use the future tense, what you say is I will love or I am going to love. Those are both ways of expressing future tense in English. The imperfect tense in Latin is a little bit more complicated than that. The imperfect tense, for now, you can think of it as a past tense. The difficulty is that in Latin, there are 2 past tenses, and together they cover the past tenses of English. The past tense that we're studying now is imperfect. There's another past tense called perfect. The difference between them is something like this. Imagine I have a pen here, and I say, I dropped my pen. Well, that is one particular event, one particular action that I'm talking about. In Latin, you would use the perfect tense for that, the one that we're not studying right now. And the same way if you said if a guy said about a girl, he said, as soon as I saw her, I loved her. Both dropped, when I was talking about the pen, and loved are what is in English called simple past. But in the first one, I dropped the pen, that's a particular event. In the second one, when I said the first time that I saw her, I loved her, that's another particular event, right? So simple past in English can sometimes express a particular event. Simple past can also express a series of events or a habitual kind of action, something that's either continuous over time or habitual or repeated. So what about if instead of saying, when I first saw her, I loved her, that's a particular event, and I'd use the perfect tense for that in Latin. What about if instead I said, all during the years that I was growing up, I loved her. I'm using the same word in the same tense, but in the first instance, when I saw her, I loved her. That's one particular event. In the second instance, it's something that was covering a whole period of time. Let me give you another example like that second one. What about if I said, every time I used to see her, I loved her? Right? That's, again, it's not a whole series of time, it's not continuous, but it's repeated or habitual actions, right? Every time I saw her, I loved her. Both the I loved her my whole life when I was growing up and every time I used to see her, I loved her, both of those in Latin would likely be expressed using the imperfect tense. So it's a kind of past tense, but it's a kind of past tense that you use for repeated action or habitual action in the past. So there are different ways of translating that in English. Sometimes when you use the imperfect, you just can use simple past. You're going to say, I love her, I loved her. Sometimes in English, you might translate the Latin best by saying, I used to love her, or I was loving her, right? You know, again, that's something that stretches it out and makes it continuous rather than a certain event. So start out with the idea that imperfect is a past tense. If you've got that, you've got most of it. And right now we're not using the perfect tense, so you don't have to distinguish it from from the perfect tense. But that's really where you want to begin. It's a past tense. If you got that, you got most of it. It's a past tense that expresses habitual or continuous action rather than a single event. Okay. Now let's take a look at page 38, how to make the imperfect tense and how to make the future tense. So the first thing you want to know about how to make the imperfect tense in Latin is the two letters BA. Those will always be part of the ending, and they'll come 5 times out of 6, they'll come before the endings that you already know. So you can see that the imperfect paradigm, if you're using voco, which is the one they use here, is vocabam, vocabas, vocabat, vocabamus, vocabatus, vocabat. You'll notice that all of those have a BA right before the final part of the ending. So that's why I say remember BA for the imperfect. You'll also notice that the first person singular, the one that's I, isn't represented by an O, it's represented by an M. So it's not vocabao, it's vocabam, right? But the others always add on the endings that you're used to pretty much after the BA. So instead of vocas, you call, it's vocabas, you were calling or you used to call. Instead of vocat in the present tense, he, she, or it calls, it's vocabat, he, she, or it used to call. So that's the pattern that you can follow all the way through. That's imperfect, and those are the meanings of the imperfect. Future tense, instead of BA, the letters you should remember that are part of the ending right before the final piece of the ending are BI. But it's a little more complicated than that, because in imperfect, BA is used every single time in the paradigm, all 6 times. All first, second, and third person singular, first, second, and third person plural. BI in the future is used 4 out of 6 times. The places that it's not used is the very first form in the paradigm and the very last form in the paradigm. So let me read them out loud. Vocabo, here we go with the BIs. Vocabis, vocabit, vocabimus, vocabitis, and here it fails you, no BI, vocabunt. Okay, so you have to learn that BO is the first one and BUNT is the last one. Otherwise it follows the pattern. So let's think about how to say in the present tense, you singular call. That's vocas. If you wanted to put it into the imperfect, you were calling or you used to call, it wouldn't be vocas, it would be vocabas. Right? If you wanted to put it into the future, you will call, you singular will call, it wouldn't be vocas or vocabas, it would be vocabis. There you're using the BI, which is the typical 2-letter combination right before the very end. But the S is the same. Vocas, vocabas, vocabis. The same for third person singular. He, she, or it. He, she, or it calls, present tense, vocat. He, she, or it was calling or used to call, vocabat. He, she, or it will call, vocabit. You see how the T stays on at the end of each one of them? Okay, so that's first conjugation verbs and how to put them in the imperfect and into the future tenses. I think that's really all that there is that you need to know about this chapter. Fairly straightforward. Just practice declining, that's not the right word, conjugating some verbs using these tenses. One thing I want to point out is that the medial vowel, if you think about the ending, say the imperfect ending for second person singular for voco is BAS. But how do you get from the stem, which is voc, to the BAS? You have to put a medial vowel in between. So it's vocabo. It's always going to be an A. It's not always going to be an A in the present tense. There's no A before the O. It's a voco, not vocao. But then it's vocas, vocat. And this is vocabat, vocabas, like that, an A before the B. And the same thing in future. vocabo, vocabis, vocabit. Don't forget that medial A vowel right after the stem. The stem for voco is voc. And then the ending is BAS, but between the stem and the ending, to make the whole imperfect form for second person singular, you got to put that medial A in there. Vocabos, no, not vocibos with an I, or vocebos with an E, or anything like that. It's got to be an A. Other than that, that is the lesson of Chapter 7. Great.